Welcome back to Paladin Podcast. Today we're going to look at a book that's similar to the first book we looked at. This one's called Collective Illusions by Todd Rose, and the subtitle is Conformity, Complicity, and the Science of Why We Make Bad Decisions. Kind of the same theme as we looked at in the first podcast. It's written in 2022, so it is a relatively new book. And as I looked at this book, my overall question is going to be, especially from a Christian perspective, are we really built to follow the herd? Because that's kind of the idea that Rose is after here, is that we are kind of built that way and that we have to consciously not do that. So I want to kind of think about that from a Christian perspective. But first I want to kind of look at what does Todd Rose really say in this book. And one of his big quotes in the beginning is, an awareness of others can change our behavior. In other words, we change how we act when we think we're being watched. And if we're being watched by a group, then we're really going to change our behavior. And one of the interesting questions he makes is, because we change our behavior, do we really change our views? Or are we just changing our behavior to go along with the herd? So that's a really interesting thing that we're going to look at. And another quote he says is that in light of this, that we make our decisions based on what the herd or everybody else wants us to do, then we tend to reality doesn't matter anymore. And this becomes what I call people pleasing at a grand scale. You know, we're not just trying to please one particular person anymore, but we're rather trying to please the whole crew. Okay, so those are kind of the overarching questions that I'm going to try to dialogue with as we look at this book. So the first issue that Rose brings up in his book is why do we conform? Why is it so easy for us to do what the herd wants us to do? Why do we make decisions and we let the group, this is not just your peers or not just someone that matters to you. That would be called peer pressure or something like that. But this is, what does everyone want? So you're kind of people pleasing on a grand scale. Well, the first reason he mentioned is the fear of being embarrassed. Because if you're not part of the herd, then you stand out. And we know from psychology that shame is a huge motivator, and the avoidance of shame is a huge motivator, so we try not to be ashamed. But then there's also the idea of, if I join this group and they turn out to be wrong, well, then we're all wrong together. And so I can spread the blame corporately, and I don't have to admit that I was wrong as an individual. I can say, no, my group was wrong, and we get to spread that out. He also mentions that sometimes we get duped by symbols of authority, and this is not new, especially in psychology. We know of certain psychological tests where if somebody shows up in a white coat, we tend to do what they want. So there's always that. But then he also mentions the fear of us versus them. And I think this is kind of interesting that he mentioned that the world oftentimes gets divided into us versus them. And nobody wants to be on team them. Everybody wants to be on team us. And so we kind of look around and see what are the views that are espoused by team us, what are the behaviors that are encouraged by team us, and we comply. Because we want to be on team us. We don't want to be on team them. And then finally, he does say that we tend to follow the groups that we identify with. We don't join every single group. We tend to join the groups that resonate with our identity. And so again, if you want to know something about somebody, this is a social psychology principle, but if you want to know who someone is, you just ask them, what groups are you part of? And part of the price of being part of that group is that you have to at least outwardly comply. You have to do what they want. You have to believe what they want. And there's a lot of groups I'm part of where it's not oppressive for me to believe what the group wants me to believe because I believe it myself. Internally, I resonate. For example, I teach at Cairn University, and I believe their doctrinal missional statement. It's not oppressive for me to sign that every year because internally I do believe it. So those are kind of the ideas of why we tend to follow the herd. There's also the biological explanation that maybe we were primed to do this. Of course, everything gets blamed on the monkeys these days, but Supposedly, we are primed to mimic, that our minds were created to watch other people and do what they do. So maybe that's part of it. I don't know. But then there's also some other reasons, but we won't get into that. But I want to go off script a little bit and talk about social media. And he does mention this in his book too, that social media is a prime example of this whole following the herd in an example. For example, majority rules on social media. Every time you click on your browser, you'll get something like 10 movies that everyone's watching this weekend, and there's just a little bit of you that thinks, well, I better click on this and find out what those 10 movies are. Because why? Because we sort of care what that group is saying are the 10 movies that we're supposed to see. And he also mentions that in the old days, fringe views didn't get near the hearing that they do now on social media. Anybody can say anything on social media. And so all kinds of fringe views get put out there. And they get put out there in the same venue as legitimate views. And so you have to sort out what's a fringe view. And all it takes is a fringe view to persuade a few people online. And suddenly you've got this big internet movement all based on, some fringe movement that normally wouldn't see the light of day, because you'd have to persuade one by one individual that this fringe view is true, but it's not. And finally, he mentions that with social media, there's a huge dependence on secondhand information, more than ever before. And if you're a researcher or a historian or a scientist or anything like that, you have an appreciation for primary sources, who really said this. And oftentimes in social media, you have people posting what they read someone else say, and then someone else said that. And so there's a whole big dependence on secondhand information or a response to secondhand information. Maybe I'm even doing that in this video. I don't know. But anyway, that's kind of the idea that Rose paints for us, that we are evolutionary based to follow the herd, that it's actually helpful to us. And again, most of the decisions that we make during the day, we want them to be fast. And that gets into his solutions. And I'll give you just 3 here, but I think 2 of them are part of the first one. The first one, he just says, ask why. When someone gives you a view, ask why. Why is that true? And we don't normally do that. And that requires us to do, and some of you know this in psychology and other fields, the idea of thinking slow versus thinking fast. And that we think fast most of the time, and that's the way we were built. But we oftentimes have to think slowly. Like when you want to make a big decision about your life, you want to slow down and look at the cost-benefit analysis and try to figure out, is this really what I want to do? And Rose's point is that when we think slowly, we become more accurate in our decisions. Not 100%, of course. You can think slow and still make a bad decision. But you decrease the odds of making a bad decision if you think slowly. But the problem is we can't think slowly about every single decision in our life. You have to function. There's a whole lot of decisions all day long that you have to make that are fast. And Rose's point is, do we even know that? Are we even aware that we are called to make slow and fast decisions? And he said that for more of our decisions, we need to think slow instead of fast. And related to that is, this is the point that I thought was really helpful as I was reading, the idea of being congruent. And what he means by that is, sometimes through fast thinking or whatever, or we just want to follow the herd, we end up participating in behaviors or saying that we believe a certain thing when we really don't. But that we say we believe it, or we behave in light of believing it, so that we can stay in the herd, so that we can be part of that group. And then what happens, that creates an incongruity within us, meaning that what I believe or what I say I believe and the way I act doesn't match with what I really believe. And so there's a tension there, which he says is something that we need to observe. and that eventually we don't live very well if we live our lives in a constant state of incongruity, that what we do and how we talk and what we do in our behavior doesn't match up with what we really believe, and we kind of know that. And then we end up, after a while, either self-deceiving ourselves that we really do believe those things that we know we don't, or we have the continual lying that we have. It feels like lying. And so again, Rose's point is what we need to do is live with some sense of congruency, meaning that what you really do believe in your heart, you need to say that out loud. You need to live in light of what you really believe so that your outside actions match what you really believe. And he thinks if we would do more of that, then we would not fall for the herd mentality as often as we do. And then finally, and this is the one that I don't really agree with, and that gets a transition into our Christian critique. He says we just need to be more trusting of people. He says that we live in a cynicism day, a day of not believing anybody, not trusting anybody, and yet we still believe people all the time. We kind of have to. With all the claims that are made on the internet, we don't have time to think slowly about every one of them, so we pick and choose the ones that we're going to believe. But he thinks we need to, if we would just trust people a little more, then we could learn from them, we could have better relationships, we wouldn't have to make decisions based on the herd as often. So that's kind of what he says. Now, remember I said the first question, my main question as a Christian is, are we built that way? Because Rose says we're built that way, but we can choose to act against the way we're built in some sense. Like when the time comes to make a slow decision, we can actually do that. I think as Christians, that's probably true. I think we are built to make fast decisions. I think God made our brains that way. And I think passages of Scripture talk about that, how that being around other believers, especially, which is why we want to gather together with other believers, has an impact on us and makes us want to, or stimulate us to love and good works, as the author of Hebrews says. And so are we really built to follow the herd? And I would say yes, but we're also built with the capacity to push back against the herd. That we can think slow, like Rose is talking about. But then this idea of being incongruent, I think Jesus talks about this a lot when he says things like, you do this on the outside, but the inside is dead man's bones. And that's kind of the reverse of what we're talking about. But he says that, the Pharisees would do good things on the outside, but in the inside, they didn't really believe in the good things that they were doing. They were just being cynical, exploiting people, and things like that. And so the incongruence, I think, is something that Jesus speaks to quite a bit. It's interesting that we would look at ourselves and think, okay, what do I really believe? And of course, that requires us to think slow. So we're back to that again. But I think beyond it all, there's also the impact of our self-deceptive sin nature. That we not only think fast because it's efficient, sometimes we think fast because we actually do agree with, if the herd is sinful and I am sinful, then there's a point where I agree with the herd, and then I want to, of course, go along with the herd, because both of us are struggling with our sinful hearts. Both of us have things that we want to change, or not necessarily that we want to change, but both of us are moving in a direction away from God. And so when the herd is moving away from God and my heart wants to move away from God, then of course joining the herd looks like a really good choice. And so I don't think, this is where I would part company with Rose, I don't think it's all about our evolutionary ancestors and we just learned how to think fast and now we have to remember to think slow. Because we can think slow and still make mistakes, because our heart is bent against God until the Holy Spirit moves in, and even then, until the Lord comes back, we're still going to struggle with sin, and some of that has to do with the way we think. So those are my thoughts on Todd Rose's book, Collective Illusions. We'll look forward to another episode next time. Thank you.